A quiet man with a dark past seeks redemption in a new life. But when he's pushed to his limits by a ruthless gang and an old enemy resurfaces, he's forced to make a choice that could either save him or drag him back into the shadows forever. Miguel walked home in his usual silence, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The alleyways he passed were familiar, yet each turn brought with it a pang of unease. He had learned long ago to avoid confrontation, but fate had a way of testing his resolve. The shadows in the narrow passage thickened as he turned into a dead-end street. He froze, his sharp eyes scanning the figures blocking his path. Marcos stood at the center of the group, his smirk a cruel invitation. The gang's laughter echoed, each taunt slicing through the quiet like a blade. Miguel clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, his knuckles whitening. He refused to meet their eyes, focusing instead on the worn cobblestones beneath his feet. The gang's insults escalated, their words filled with venom and mockery. Miguel's breath quickened, but he kept his head down, knowing full well the futility of a fight. "Not going to say anything, freak?" Marcos sneered, stepping closer. A phone camera gleamed in the dim light, capturing every moment of Miguel's humiliation. They shoved him, their laughter growing louder as he stumbled but didn't retaliate. The taunts dragged him back in time, to a life he desperately tried to bury. Flashes of his past surged forth, dark alleys, sharp commands, and the cold satisfaction of control. But those days were over. He had promised himself, promised her, that he would never return to that life. Yet here he was, cornered and exposed. Miguel endured their mockery in silence, his resolve shaking under the weight of his memories. Finally, the gang grew bored. Marcos delivered a final shove, sending Miguel sprawling to the ground, his palms scraping against the rough pavement. The gang left, their laughter fading into the distance, leaving Miguel alone with his shame. When he finally rose, the sting of his wounds was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. He walked home under the cloak of night, his steps heavy with a mix of anger and regret. The small apartment he called home offered no comfort, only an empty silence that mirrored his own turmoil. Sitting by the window, Miguel stared out at the city lights, his reflection on the glass a haunting reminder of who he used to be. He had built this quiet life brick by brick, distancing himself from the man he once was. But tonight had reopened old scars, and the memories flooded back with relentless force. He closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. The image of Marcos's sneering face burned in his mind. The humiliation was temporary, but the fear it stirred, that he might lose control, was far more lasting. Miguel clenched his fists, trying to suppress the rising tide of his past. He had walked away from that life for a reason, and he wasn't about to let a group of teenagers pull him back into the shadows. Yet, as the hours ticked by, sleep eluded him. The echoes of the gang's laughter and the weight of his own restraint gnawed at him. He knew better than anyone that the world was not kind to those who appeared weak. The old Miguel would have struck fear into their hearts. But he wasn't that man anymore. He couldn't be. Morning crept in, its pale light doing little to dispel the darkness within him. Miguel remained by the window, lost in thought, as the city began to stir around him. He resolved to maintain his routine, to keep the life he had fought so hard to rebuild. But deep down, he knew the events of the night would not be so easily left behind. For now, all he could do was wait, hoping the storm brewing on the horizon would pass him by. Miguel's hands trembled as he unlocked the door to his modest apartment, the familiar creak of the hinges welcoming him home. He shut the door behind him with deliberate care, leaning against it for a moment as if it could shield him from the memories clawing at his mind. The humiliation he endured replayed relentlessly, each jeer and shove carving deeper wounds into his already fragile resolve. The apartment was sparse but orderly, a reflection of the disciplined life Miguel had built for himself. He moved mechanically, setting his keys on the counter and rinsing the blood from his scraped palms. The water ran red for a moment before swirling down the drain, a sight that reminded him of a past he had no intention of revisiting. But his mind betrayed him, dredging up images of days when his hands weren't used for survival. They were used for dominance. A knock on the wall jolted him back to the present. "Miguel, are you okay?" came a soft voice from the other side. It was Camila, his neighbor, a young woman whose curiosity often bordered on intrusion. Miguel hesitated, his instincts urging him to stay silent, but the concern in her voice was genuine. "I'm fine," he replied curtly, hoping the tone would end the conversation. It didn't. "You don't sound fine. Did something happen?" she pressed, her voice tinged with worry. Miguel clenched his jaw, frustrated by her persistence. Just a bad day, that's all. The silence that followed was heavy, but eventually he heard her footsteps retreating. He let out a slow breath, grateful for the reprieve. Miguel didn't want anyone prying into his life, especially not someone as well-meaning as Camila. The fewer people involved, the better. Across the city, in a dimly lit office, Ramon leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched the viral video on his phone. The grainy footage showed Miguel being cornered, his stoic expression a stark contrast to the jeering faces around him. Ramon's keen eye caught the subtle tension in Miguel's stance, a telltale sign of restraint. He knew Miguel too well to believe this meek facade. Beneath the surface lay a man capable of far more than those kids could imagine. "Looks like the prodigal son hasn't forgotten his roots," Ramon murmured, stroking his beard thoughtfully. For years he had tried to coax Miguel back into the fold, but the younger man had been stubborn, determined to sever ties with the underworld. This video, however, presented an opportunity. Ramon saw it as a crack in Miguel's carefully constructed armor, one he intended to exploit. As the night deepened, Miguel sat in his apartment, oblivious to the machinations taking shape elsewhere. He stared at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. The humiliation was painful, but the memories it unearthed were far worse. He had worked tirelessly to distance himself from that life, to bury the person he once was. But now, with Ramon watching and the world unknowingly pulling at the threads of his past, Miguel felt the weight of an inevitability he wasn't ready to face. For now, though, he remained still, locked in a silent struggle with himself. The following afternoon, Miguel made his way home from the market, his backpack filled with essentials. The streets were busier than usual, the hum of the city offering a welcome distraction from the storm brewing inside him. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, each one measured and deliberate. But even as he walked, a familiar unease crept up his spine, a predator's instinct honed from years of survival. Turning a corner, he saw them, Marcos and his gang, lounging by a row of parked motorcycles. Miguel's pulse quickened, but his face betrayed nothing. He considered retreating, but it was too late. Marcos had already spotted him. "Look who it is!" Marcos called out, his voice dripping with mockery. The gang straightened, their grins widening as they closed ranks. Miguel slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the area for an escape route. None presented itself. Marcos approached, his swagger exaggerated. "Still not gonna say anything, huh? What's wrong, freak? Cat got your tongue?" Miguel's silence seemed to embolden them. One of the gang members stepped forward, shoving him. Another grabbed at his backpack, yanking it off his shoulder. The contents spilled onto the pavement. Bread, eggs, a carton of milk. Laughter erupted as the milk carton burst, its contents pooling at Miguel's feet. "Oops," Marcos sneered. "Clumsy, aren't you?" The gang's laughter filled the street, drawing the attention of a few passers-by, who quickly looked away. Miguel clenched his fists at his sides, his breathing slow and steady. A part of him screamed to walk away, to let it go. But another part, buried deep, began to stir. When Marcos reached out to shove him again, Miguel moved. It happened in a blur. Miguel sidestepped the shove with precision, his hand snapping out to grab Marcos's wrist. A sharp twist sent the gang leader to his knees, a cry of pain escaping his lips. The gang froze, their laughter replaced by stunned silence. Miguel released Marcos and turned to the others, his eyes cold and unyielding. When one of them lunged at him, Miguel pivoted smoothly, using the man's momentum against him. The attacker stumbled, crashing into a trash bin. Another rushed in, swinging a fist, but Miguel ducked, delivering a swift strike to his ribs that left him gasping for air. Within seconds, the gang was scattered, their confidence shattered. Miguel stood in the center of the chaos, his stance calm and deliberate. His breath came in measured bursts, his mind eerily quiet. He hadn't wanted this, but the moment demanded it. Marcos, still on his knees, glared up at him. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You're dead, freak, you hear me?" Miguel said nothing. He bent down, picked up his scattered groceries, and placed them back in his backpack. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. From the shadows, Ramon watched the scene unfold. His lips curled into a knowing smile as he stepped back into the alley. The Miguel he remembered, the strategist, the fighter, the man who commanded respect through action, was still there, buried beneath layers of restraint. Ramon had seen enough. It was time to confront him. That evening, as Miguel sat in his apartment, Ramon arrived uninvited, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You've been busy," he said, his tone light but probing. Miguel didn't look up. "Go away, Ramon. Come on, amigo. You can't pretend this isn't who you are. I saw what you did today. They had no chance against you." Miguel's gaze remained fixed on the floor. "It's not who I am anymore." Ramon stepped closer, his voice softening. "Maybe not, but you can't outrun your past forever." The room fell silent, the weight of Ramon's words hanging heavy in the air. Miguel's resolve wavered, but he said nothing. Ramon's presence was a reminder of a life he wanted to forget, a life that refused to let him go. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. Inside her small apartment, Camila scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly. A notification popped up, a video tagged as viral. She tapped on it, the screen lighting up with the grainy footage of Miguel being cornered in the alley. Her breath caught as she recognized his stoic figure amidst the jeering gang. She watched the clip twice, her heart sinking. The Miguel she knew was quiet, reserved, and polite. Yet here he was, enduring an onslaught of humiliation without a word. She couldn't reconcile the man in the video with the neighbor who watered his plants every morning and nodded politely when they crossed paths. Curiosity turned to concern. Camila grabbed her jacket and headed next door. She knocked softly but firmly, her worry outweighing her usual hesitation. After a long pause, the door creaked open just enough for Miguel's tired face to appear. "What is it?" he asked, his voice edged with weariness. Camila hesitated, holding up her phone. "I saw the video." Miguel's eyes flicked to the screen and back to her. His expression remained unreadable, but his grip on the door tightened. "It's nothing," he said flatly, starting to close the door. Camila stepped forward. "Nothing? Miguel, this is serious. Those kids." "It doesn't matter," he interrupted, his tone final. "I can handle it." "But you shouldn't have to," she insisted. "You can't just ignore—" "I said I can handle it," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. The sudden edge startled her, and Miguel immediately softened, guilt flashing across his face. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I just don't want to talk about it." Camila studied him for a moment, her concern deepening. "If you ever need help, I'm here," she said softly, stepping back. Miguel nodded once before closing the door. Inside, Miguel leaned against the wood, exhaling heavily. He didn't need Camila's sympathy, not when he was fighting to keep his past buried. Yet her words lingered, a small reminder that someone cared, a dangerous sentiment for a man like him. Meanwhile, across town, the local police were reviewing the same video. What had initially seemed like a petty act of bullying had drawn attention for a different reason. A senior officer paused the footage, scrutinizing Miguel's calculated movements as he evaded the gang. "Rewind that," the officer ordered. The room fell silent as the video played again. The technique was subtle, but unmistakable, a form of combat training not typically seen on the streets. The officer frowned, noting Miguel's face. "Run a background check," he instructed. Back in his apartment, Miguel remained unaware of the growing scrutiny. He sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The encounter with Ramon weighed on him, but so did Camila's concern. His life had been built on a fragile balance of anonymity and discipline. Now that balance was slipping, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it together. Miguel woke early, the first rays of dawn creeping through his window. His routine was unchanged: push-ups, a quick shower, and a cup of black coffee. Yet his mind buzzed with unease, the events of the past days replaying in vivid detail. The quiet life he had worked so hard to cultivate felt like a distant memory, slipping further from his grasp with each passing moment. He sat at his small kitchen table, a notepad and pen before him. Old habits resurfaced as he began sketching a crude map of the neighborhood. The alleys, intersections, and potential escape routes took form on the page. Miguel's movements were precise, almost mechanical. Years of experience whispered in his ear, guiding his hand as he planned for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The knock on his door startled him, the pen slipping in his grip. He quickly folded the map and tucked it into his pocket before crossing the room. Opening the door, he found Ramon leaning against the frame, his usual smirk in place. "Early riser, huh?" Ramon said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Miguel closed the door with a sigh. "What do you want?" "I came to talk," Ramon replied, his tone deceptively casual. He wandered the small apartment, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. I saw the way you handled those kids. Impressive. You haven't lost your touch. I'm not interested, Miguel said firmly, leaning against the counter. Ramon chuckled, turning to face him. Not interested in what? Protecting yourself? Because from where I'm standing, you've got a target on your back. Marcos isn't the type to let this go, and you know it. Miguel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Ramon stepped closer, his voice softening. You don't have to do this alone, amigo. Come back. With me, you'll have protection, resources, everything you need. I don't want that life, Miguel said, his tone cold. Not anymore. Ramon studied him for a moment, then sighed dramatically. Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you. He started for the door, pausing to glance back. When you change your mind, you know where to find me. After Ramon left, Miguel stared at the closed door, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Ramon's offer was tempting in its own way, but Miguel knew the price of re-entering that world. It was a cost he wasn't willing to pay. Instead, he turned his focus back to his plan. He spent the rest of the day walking the neighborhood, his sharp eyes noting details others would overlook. A loose fence panel here, a stack of crates there. Every detail was logged in his mind, part of a larger strategy. As the sun set, Miguel returned home, exhausted but resolute. He spread the map on the table, adding notes and refining his approach. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wouldn't let himself be cornered again. If Marcos wanted a confrontation, Miguel would dictate the terms. Across town, Marcos seethed. His pride was wounded, his gang shaken by their encounter with Miguel. But Marcos wasn't one to back down. He spent hours rallying his group, their anger fueled by his fiery rhetoric. By the end of the night, their plan was set, an ambush that would leave no room for Miguel to escape. Unbeknownst to either of them, their preparations were being watched. The police, now aware of Miguel's identity, had begun tailing him. His movements, though subtle, raised more questions than answers. To them, Miguel wasn't just a victim, he was a puzzle that demanded solving. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Miguel sat by his window, staring at the darkened streets below. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. But this time, he was ready. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that hung in the air before a storm. Miguel crouched behind a row of stacked crates in an abandoned warehouse, his senses sharpened. He had chosen this location deliberately, a place where the environment could work to his advantage. The faint hum of the city outside was a distant memory here. Inside, the world was his battlefield. He heard them before he saw them. The crunch of boots on gravel echoed through the vast, empty space. Marcos and his gang entered cautiously, their laughter subdued, their confidence replaced with unease. Miguel's earlier display had shaken them, but Marcos was determined to reclaim his dominance. "Spread out," Marcos ordered, his voice low but firm. The gang obeyed, fanning out across the warehouse, their flashlights casting erratic beams through the darkness. Miguel remained still, his breath steady. He had mapped every inch of the space beforehand, noting the weak points and chokeholds. He wasn't here to fight for glory or revenge. This was about survival, and he would ensure no lives were lost tonight. The first move came quickly. A gang member strayed too close to Miguel's hiding spot, his flashlight sweeping across the crates. Miguel struck with precision, disarming the boy and pinning him silently to the ground. A quick gesture signaled him to stay quiet, and the terrified youth nodded, scrambling away as soon as Miguel released him. Miguel moved like a shadow, neutralizing each member with calculated efficiency. A tripwire he'd set earlier sent one sprawling, his weapon skidding across the floor. Another stumbled into a stack of barrels Miguel had rigged to collapse, the noise disorienting the group further. Marcos grew increasingly agitated, his frustration evident in the sharp commands he barked. "Show yourself, coward!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Miguel stepped into the open, his movements deliberate. He locked eyes with Marcos, his expression calm but unyielding. For a moment, the gang leader hesitated, the weight of Miguel's presence pressing down on him. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Marcos spat, raising a makeshift weapon. "You're nothing." Miguel didn't respond. Instead, he moved with startling speed, disarming Marcos with a fluid motion that left the younger man gasping for breath. Miguel didn't strike back, he simply stood there, the silence between them louder than any words. Get out, Miguel said finally, his voice low but commanding. All of you, now! The gang scrambled to obey, dragging their wounded pride and bruised egos with them. Marcos lingered, his glare filled with hatred, but even he knew better than to challenge Miguel again. He turned and fled, his footsteps fading into the distance. Miguel stood alone in the warehouse, the adrenaline slowly fading. He had won this battle, but the victory felt hollow. The violence, though controlled, had pulled him closer to a version of himself he had fought to leave behind. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. Morning light crept through the slats of Miguel's blinds, but sleep had evaded him. The events of the night before weighed heavily on his mind. He had succeeded in avoiding unnecessary harm, but the encounter had chipped away at the fragile peace he had built. His reflection in the mirror bore witness to his turmoil, a man caught between two lives, neither of which felt fully his own. The knock at his door was insistent. Miguel hesitated before opening it, finding Camila on the threshold, her face a mixture of concern and determination. In her hands she clutched a folder, its edges worn from frequent handling. "I need to talk to you," she said, stepping past him into the apartment before he could respond. "Camila, now's not a good time. I found this," she interrupted, holding up the folder. "I think you owe me an explanation." Miguel's blood ran cold as she opened it, revealing documents and photographs. His past stared back at him in black and white, newspaper clippings, police reports, and surveillance images of a younger, colder version of himself. The name Miguel Castillo was written boldly across multiple pages, each detailing his notorious exploits as a mastermind in the criminal underworld. "Where did you get this?" Miguel asked, his voice low and steady, though his hands betrayed him with a slight tremor. "I was cleaning out the storage room in the building," she admitted. "I found it in an old box. At first, I didn't believe it could be you, but after everything I've seen these past few days..." She trailed off, her gaze locking onto his. Miguel turned away, running a hand through his hair. The walls he had carefully constructed around his new life were crumbling. "It's true," he said finally. "That man in the files. That was me. A long time ago." Camilla's voice was quiet but firm. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I've been trying to leave it behind," he replied. "I came here to disappear, to start over, but the past doesn't let go that easily." As they spoke, Ramon entered the apartment uninvited, his presence as unwelcome as ever. He gave a mock bow, his smirk firmly in place. "I see the truth is out. Saves me the trouble of explaining." Miguel's jaw tightened. "What do you want now?" Ramon dropped onto the couch, unbothered by Miguel's glare. "Just thought you should know, Marcos isn't acting alone. He's being used by an old acquaintance of ours." Miguel stiffened. "Who?" "Alejandro," Ramon said, his tone dropping. "He hasn't forgotten what you did. Marcos is just a pawn in his game." The weight of Ramon's words settled heavily between them. Alejandro was a name Miguel had hoped never to hear again, a reminder of decisions that had cost him dearly. Camilla's eyes darted between the two men. "Who's Alejandro?" she asked, her voice breaking the tense silence. Miguel turned to her, his expression solemn. "Someone I thought I'd never have to face again." The abandoned warehouse stood at the edge of the city, its rusted walls and shattered windows, a stark reminder of the decay Miguel had left behind. Tonight it would serve as the battleground for a confrontation he could no longer avoid. Miguel walked through the shadows with purpose, his breath steady, his mind calculating every variable. He had summoned them both, Marcos and Ramon, knowing full well the risks involved. The interior of the warehouse was cavernous, its silence punctuated by the occasional creak of metal. Miguel positioned himself near a central pillar, his back straight, his posture unyielding. He had spent hours preparing, mapping the space in his mind. Tonight he wasn't just defending himself, he was taking control. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, followed by the low hum of voices. Marcos appeared first, flanked by two members of his gang. His face was a mix of anger and confusion, his confidence tempered by the memory of Miguel's earlier display. Ramon followed shortly after, his swagger unshaken. He offered Miguel a small salute, his smirk as infuriating as ever. "Quite the reunion," Ramon said, his voice echoing through the space. "What's the occasion?" "You know why we're here," Miguel replied, his tone cold. His eyes shifted to Marcos. "You've been played. Everything you've done, every move you've made, it's all been orchestrated by him. He gestured toward Ramon. Marcos frowned, his fists clenching. What the hell is he talking about? Think about it, Miguel continued. Who gave you the resources? Who fed you information about me? Ramon has been pulling your strings from the start. And for what? To drag me back into a life I left behind. Marcos turned to Ramon, suspicion clouding his features. Ramon chuckled, clapping slowly. Bravo, Miguel. You've always been good at reading between the lines, but you left out the best part. Alejandro. He's the one who really wants you back in the game. I'm just a messenger. Miguel's chest tightened at the mention of Alejandro. I'm done with that world. Whatever he wants, he won't get it. Maybe not, Ramon said with a shrug. But you know better than anyone. People like Alejandro don't take no for an answer. The tension in the room crackled like electricity. Marcos's confusion shifted to rage, his glare fixed on Ramon. You used me, he growled. You fed me lies and set me up to fail. And you made it so easy, Ramon replied, his smirk widening. Before Ramon could react, Marcos lunged at him, fists flying. The sudden violence threw the room into chaos. Miguel stepped back, watching the two men grapple, their shouts echoing through the warehouse. Marcos's gang members hesitated, unsure of whether to intervene. Miguel seized the moment, moving with precision. He disarmed the gang members quickly, his movements a blur of practiced efficiency. By the time they recovered, the fight between Marcos and Ramon had escalated, with both men trading blows fueled by betrayal and fury. Enough! Miguel's voice cut through the commotion like a blade. He stepped between them, shoving them apart. Both men stumbled back, panting and glaring at each other. This ends here, Miguel said firmly. I don't care what grudges you have, or who you think you're fighting for. I won't be dragged into your games. Marcos wiped blood from his lip, his expression conflicted. Ramon for once looked unsettled, his smirk fading under Miguel's unwavering gaze. The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of Miguel's authority pressing down on them both. This is my final warning, Miguel continued. Leave me out of this. If either of you come after me again, I won't show mercy. With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Behind him, the two men stood frozen. The balance of power irrevocably shifted. The air in the police station was sterile and suffocating. Miguel sat on a hard bench, his hands folded in his lap. His gaze was steady, fixed on the peeling paint of the wall across from him. He had made his decision, a choice that felt both liberating and crushing. Turning himself in was the only way to finally sever the ties to his past, to stop the cycle of violence from consuming what was left of his soul. The officers had been cautious when they brought him in. Miguel's reputation preceded him, even in this quiet part of the city. They knew the man in front of them was no ordinary suspect. Yet Miguel offered no resistance, his demeanor calm and cooperative. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to atone. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and Miguel turned to see Camila approaching. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She stopped a few feet away, clutching her jacket tightly. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. Why did you turn yourself in? Miguel sighed, the weight of the question pressing on him. Because it's the only way to end this, he replied. If I stay out there, people will keep coming for me. Ramon, Alejandro, even Marcos. They won't stop until I'm either dead or back in the game. This is the only way to make it stop. Camila shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You don't deserve this. You've been trying to change, to be better. You don't belong here. Maybe not, Miguel admitted. But I can't run forever. If I keep fighting, I'll become the man I used to be. And I can't let that happen. Camila stepped closer, her voice softening. There has to be another way. Turning yourself in doesn't erase what you've done to make things right. Miguel's lips twitched into a faint smile. No, it doesn't. But it's a start. Before Camila could respond, an officer approached, clipboard in hand. Time's up, he said curtly. Miguel stood, towering over the officer for a moment before giving Camila a final glance. Take care of yourself, he said, and thank you for everything. Camila wanted to argue, to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She could only nod as Miguel followed the officer down the hall, his shoulders straight, his stride purposeful. Meanwhile, across the city, Ramon sat in his dimly lit apartment, nursing a drink. The events at the warehouse played over in his mind, a bitter reminder of how easily Miguel had outmaneuvered him. Alejandro wouldn't take this failure lightly, and Ramon knew the clock was ticking on his own survival. As Miguel was led into a holding cell, a strange sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past lifting, replaced by the faintest glimmer of hope. He had chosen this path, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The cell was small, its gray walls bare and unwelcoming. Miguel sat on the narrow cot, staring at the patch of sky visible through the high barred window. The faint sound of the world outside reached him, distant car horns, the murmur of voices, but it all felt detached, as if it belonged to a different life. Despite the confinement, Miguel felt a strange sense of calm. He had made his choice, and for the first time, he was no longer running from himself. News of Miguel's surrender spread quickly through the city. The video of his confrontation with Marcos had surfaced online, fueling both speculation and sympathy. Some saw him as a dangerous man who belonged behind bars. Others viewed him as a figure of redemption, a symbol of someone fighting to leave behind a dark past. In her apartment, Camila sat by the window, staring at the same patch of sky. She couldn't stop replaying their last conversation in her mind. Miguel's words, his resolve. They had moved her in ways she hadn't expected. She didn't see a criminal or a man trying to atone for sins. She saw someone who had risked everything to carve out a life of peace, only to have it torn away by forces beyond his control. Driven by this conviction, Camila began researching Miguel's past in earnest. She pored over old files, piecing together the narrative of his life. The evidence painted a picture of a man who had once been consumed by power and ambition, but had spent years trying to make amends. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to fight for him, to show the world the man he had become. Meanwhile, Ramon found himself cornered. Alejandro had learned of his failure and was quick to exact his punishment. Stripped of his influence and allies, Ramon realized too late that he had underestimated Miguel, not just as an opponent, but as a man who could change the game entirely. His own life now mirrored the chaos he had sown, a bitter reminder of the consequences of his choices. Back in the prison, Miguel became something of an enigma among the other inmates. He kept to himself, his calm demeanor unnerving those who expected aggression. Yet over time, his quiet strength and willingness to listen drew others to him. His story, shared in fragments, began to inspire those around him, men who had lost hope of ever escaping the cycles of violence and crime. Months passed, and Miguel found purpose in the monotony of prison life. He joined educational programs, taught self-defense classes, and encouraged others to think beyond their circumstances. His actions earned him the respect of inmates and guards alike, though he never sought recognition. For Miguel, it wasn't about redemption in the eyes of others. It was about finally living in alignment with his own values. Outside, Camila's efforts gained momentum. She reached out to journalists, human rights advocates, and legal experts, weaving together a narrative of Miguel's transformation. Public opinion began to shift, and the growing support sparked discussions about reform, second chances, and the systemic issues that pushed people into lives of crime. On a rainy afternoon, Camila visited Miguel, her resolve stronger than ever. They sat across from each other, separated by a pane of glass, but the distance felt smaller than before. "They're listening," she said, her voice filled with hope. "People are starting to see who you really are." Miguel smiled faintly. "That's good. But it's not just about me. If this helps others, people like me, find a way out, then it's worth it." As the visit ended, Miguel returned to his cell, his heart lighter. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt at peace. His story wasn't just his own anymore. It was a testament to resilience, change, and the possibility of a new beginning, even in the darkest of places. The story of Miguel reminds us that no matter how dark our past may be, the choices we make today shape who we become tomorrow. It's a tale of resilience, redemption, and the courage to stand against the shadows of our own history. If you were in Miguel's place, facing the weight of your past while trying to build a better future, how would you have acted? Would you choose to confront it head-on or walk away? Click the video on your screen now to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore how the power of choice can redefine our lives. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire.